Great. Well, thank you firstly to Susan and the Association of Diplomatic Studies and Training here for her leadership, for their innovation in, in trying to look back in order to look forward. And of course, today we're going to look at a critical juncture, arguably a turning point in the history of the Great Lakes region of Africa. We're going to look back to March 22, 1994, when the two people beside me first met. And to do that, first I'll introduce them and then allow them both to speak to their own understanding of one another and who they represented before we go into a structured conversation. Firstly about the context, then about the meeting itself, specifically what they recall happened, and then of course looked at the aftermath, what you all know then transpired, the connection between the two, and what that means, you know, for how those fortunate enough, you know, to go through the kind of training that the ADST provides and to serve as representatives of their respective countries can learn in order to drive more constructive, perhaps, approaches and, of course, most importantly, outcomes. So firstly, if I may introduce Ambassador Prudence Bushnell. Ambassador Bushnell is, you know, sort of as foreign service as they come. She was born into a foreign service family. Her father was a foreign service officer, and as a consequence, she had the fortune of growing up with that life experience in South Asia, the Middle East, Europe. She graduated from the University of Maryland and undertook her graduate studies and completed those at Russell Sage College. She then went into management consulting for a brief time before, in 1981, entering the Foreign Service herself. By 1993, she had risen to the position of Deputy Assistant Secretary for Africa. And of course, this was a particularly topical and important time to enter such a posting with the episode in Mogadishu in 1993. And then, of course, in 1994, she led US diplomacy towards the Great Lakes region as the Assistant Secretary retained, that was George Moose, retained his focus predominantly on Southern Africa, and of course the transition from apartheid in particular in South Africa. In 1996 she was appointed by President Clinton to serve as ambassador to Kenya. She was of course ambassador there in 1998 when the embassy alongside that in Dar es Salaam was bombed, despite her warnings and pleadings for an upgrade, including in security of the embassy. She was appointed in 1999 to be ambassador to Guatemala and has founded the Levitt Leadership Institute at Hamilton College, aside from publishing numerous articles and books on international relations and her personal experience. To my left, we're fortunate to be joined by Dr. Theogene Rudasingwa. Dr. Rudasingwa was formerly ambassador of Rwanda to the United States. Prior to that posting, he served as Secretary General of the Rwandan Patriotic Front during the armed conflict in Rwanda, which, as you may know, ran from 1990 to 1994. he was also Chief of Staff to President Paul Kagame, but since 2005 has lived in exile here in the United States. He holds a medical degree from Makerere University in Kampala, Uganda, and a master's degree in international relations from the Fletcher School at Tufts University here in the United States. Thank you both for joining us. So now perhaps I'll hand the floor first to Ambassador Bushnell to tell us, you know, sort of where you'd come from, what your understanding was, and walk us towards that meeting. Give us that context before I hand to Theo to do the same.
As you noted, I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for African Affairs under my boss, George Moose. Assistant Secretary Moose decided to do things differently in our organization. And he gave me responsibility not for a part of Africa, which was traditional, one region of Africa, but for all transnational issues in 46 African countries. So I had the policy portfolio for drugs, thugs, disease, humanitarian assistance, refugees. Women were considered a transnational issue at the time, along with HIV/AIDS, democracy, conflict resolution. I actually spent most of my time on areas of conflict because one cannot get to fighting disease, promoting women, or anything else unless you have peace. So I spent a lot of time on issues of peacekeeping, and within the first 3 months of my arrival at the Africa Bureau, I began sitting in endless peacekeeping meetings regarding the amount of money that the U.S. was giving toward international UN peacekeeping, and the great desire not just to reduce the percentage which we provided, but also to reduce the number of peacekeeping missions in Africa in particular. Peacekeeping missions that came about as a result of the proxy wars that our country had been running in Africa. So from the very beginning, the issue of peacekeeping, how much peacekeeping that we can have, how much peacekeeping we can retain, was in a tension with two important political leanings of the Clinton administration in the first term. One was the fact that President Clinton had come into office on the economy stupid. He wanted to get rid of the budget deficit. And the second was the decision that had been made prior to President Clinton to open up diplomatic facilities all over the Soviet Union without asking the taxpayer to pay a dime of increase. Those funds came out of Africa. In particular, as we saw AID programs, we saw all kinds of programs and assets moving north from the continent into the former Soviet Union. So before I even got to the portfolio of Rwanda, which had been given to me because there were 3 countries in conflict that were of particular interest to the Africa Bureau. That was Liberia, Rwanda, and Burundi. So in addition to an overall peacekeeping and transnational portfolio, I also had specific responsibilities for the policy oversight of those 3 countries. Things were not going well in March of 1993, which is why I arrived in the land of a
1,000 hills.
1,000 hills, Milcoline, and a beautiful, beautiful country.
Well, I I came to the field of diplomacy from a different perspective, and I would say that I would be the least expected to have ended up being a diplomat. If I was to very briefly tell you a bit of my story, you would understand where I come from, because I was born at a very contentious period in African history. That is the period of decolonization. You might recall that if the first country to become independent in Africa was Ghana, 1957, most of the other countries became formally independent in the early 60s. And that tells you a bit of my age, because that's when I was born. And because of the nature of Rwanda's contentious history itself, I'm sure everybody knows here, if you don't know anything else about Rwanda, you will know that it has these three ethnic groups: the Hutus, the Tutsis, and the Twas, and especially the two notorious ones, the Tutsis and the Hutus, and I happen to be Tutsi. And because of that transition to independence, my ethnic group that had been in power, because Rwanda was run by kings for several centuries, in 1959 there was a switch, and the Hutus for the first time came into the governing role, which before then had been literally shut to them. But the consequence was that while the Hutus came to power, it also meant that it was a violent process, and many Tutsis were killed, some Hutus were also killed, but many Tutsis ended up going into exile. So I lost my father to the violence when I was barely 1 year old, and for the next 3 decades, my family, my mother and 4 of us siblings, we became refugees in Burundi, refugees in Tanzania, in Kenya, and it's in Uganda that I grew up in a refugee camp literally for 3 decades before I and many others took up arms. In other words, to go back home, but by force of arms. It's very important to understand that, because the world of diplomacy, and I'm sure we shall come back to that later, often forgets this subtext, this underlying grievances that a people might have, and which certainly ends up carrying everything else they are trying to do. So it's under these conditions that we took up arms, because we were refugees going back home in 1990. But by 1993, our group, the Rwandese Patriotic Front, had signed a peace agreement with the government of Rwanda in August 1993. I was part of the negotiating team. I was part of the group that came to United Nations to talk to Boutros Ghali, then Assistant Secretary for, Secretary General for the United Nations, to help us speed up the process of bringing in a peacekeeping force, because it was this peacekeeping force that was supposed to oversee the setup of the transitional government, that our group, having laid down their arms as part of the peace process, would be part of a transitional government. So us, the other political groups, and the government of Rwanda. And of course, there were delays, the usual international bureaucracy, we shall be talking about that. And so we came to Mulindi on, Ambassador Bushner comes to Mulindi on March 22nd, 1994, because essentially there was a delay in setting up the transitional government, because my group, my organization, contested one of the smaller parties that the government of the day, the party in charge in Rwanda, wanted to become part of the transitional government. And for us, we are saying over our dead bodies. So that's how we came to Mulindi.
And to take you back perhaps one step, and just to ask, what was your conception of how your group, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, and just for those unfamiliar with the geography of Rwanda, Malindi, the location, is in the north. And of course, Theo's group, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, had entered from Uganda, which is to the north of Rwanda, I'm sure many of you know, but just for those in case that they'd not. And my question is really, to what extent did you believe at that time that this was the primary concern, this issue of this political party being included in a power sharing arrangement, and to what extent were there other issues that informed the Rwandan Patriotic Front's position to on the power sharing as it had been put forward in the peace negotiations that were ongoing in Arusha, Tanzania?
Yeah, two things come to my mind. One is that both the government of the day and the Rwandese Patriotic Front, which I belong to, were reluctant negotiators. Neither the government of Rwanda nor the Rwandese Patriotic Front really enthusiastically embraced the process of ending this conflict by peaceful means. We always felt that everyone in the international community was breathing over our heads, saying negotiate, 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 sometimes directed to us and sometimes through the kind of allies, other stakeholders that were allied to the principal protagonists, to say that in the case of the government of Rwanda, France traditionally was the friend of Rwanda, and Belgium, of course, and in the minds of ethnic groups in Rwanda, we used to make, and we still do make jokes about it, that the French and the Belgians are Hutus. And of late, if you listen to the Hutus and other people, they say, oh, Americans and the British are Tutsis. So Americans and the British are the new Tutsis of Rwanda. But simply to emphasize.
Don't tell the French and the Belgians.
Yes, yes. And on our side, we're being supported by Uganda at that time. In fact, at that time, the United States, if there was any problem, it was that the United States really had no interest in Rwanda, nor did they, look at RPF as friends at that time. So we're reluctant negotiators. And because of that, the period between the signing of the peace agreement in August 1993 to the start of the genocide, the shooting down of the plane, the genocide beginning on April 7, was a period in which both sides prepared should the peace agreement fail. It's as if really in the minds of the government of Rwanda and the RPF, especially at the top leadership level, it's as if we knew that this thing is not going to work. And so we used the ceasefire and the quiet and the apparent calm on the surface actually to prepare for another go at resumption of hostilities between the two parties. And so when the United States and other players came to Malindi, it was as if we were saying, okay, we are going to implement the peace agreement, but we also knew, which probably the United States and other players didn't know, or which they knew and decided to keep quiet about it, is that both sides were actually preparing for an escalation of the conflict should the peace agreement fail to be implemented. Of course, the rest of history, but that's how we looked at that situation.
Mm-hmm. I'm fascinated to hear you say this, which is why we wanted to have this conversation. I was coming in to Rwanda because we in the Africa Bureau were very aware of increased killings on both sides. We were aware of armed catches. We were aware of the reluctance on both sides. And as I walked in, having just been to Liberia and going and talking to the different warlords in Liberia, to me, this was, here we go again. And in fact, I have always kept a journal, and I wrote about the day we went up to Mulindi. I wrote about what a beautiful, empty countryside we were seeing in RPF territory. And I wrote of my huge frustration that we were engaged in theater.
In theater.
In theater, that we were delivering messages to one another. I had very little anticipation that, number one, you would listen to me, because I had been interacting with many warlords, and frankly, that's a prism through which I saw many of the players in Rwanda. I also knew that it was, I certainly found in Liberia that it was very upsetting to have a white woman come in and interact directly, because I found many warlords have no idea how to socially interact with women as equals. So I came in with the notion, well, here we go again. I had spoken to President Habyarimana. I had been in, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 meetings, and everybody had someone else to blame for the peace process not moving forward. Coming up to Mulindi, I was frankly surprised not to be speaking with Paul Kagame, because if you remember, it was Alexis Kanyarengwe,
yes.
Who was the interlocutor, and I think we were speaking in French.
Yes.
So I had anticipated that I would be speaking with Paul Kagame in English, and then here's this man who comes up, and I said many of the same words to him that I had said in French to President Habyarimana, which was, the U.S. cannot put the peace together, you need to. My point was, the United States, there were skeptics in Washington who would have loved nothing more than to pull the peacekeepers, because the Somalia shadow was an extraordinary, long and deep one. So we had to fight on our end. Considerable bureaucratic tension went into the U.S. support for the UNAMIR. And frankly, it was the French who twisted our arms to support UNAMIR. So first we were negotiated into UNAMIR at the Security Council. And then every time there was a hiccup, it was, well, they shouldn't have been in there, we should get them out. And I came in, I've never been particularly diplomatic, but I have always been very honest. And I came in good faith to say, this is what is happening in Washington, and I sure hope, and by the way, because the only other negotiating thing I had was, you're losing money. So it was, please go back to the peace process, A, because we want peace, and B, because you may be losing money, and C, because the peacekeepers may be removed. And I was quite aware that, so I say it was theater. You were playing your part, I was playing my part, and we both left before the curtain fell.
Can I ask about that question? I mean, the premise of that question is the idea that those arguments were going to be persuasive, right? Persuasive in the sense of, here are your interests in achieving some compromise, some arrangement to which both parties commit, in substance as well as rhetoric. What informed those assumptions? Because perhaps from a realist, self-interested point of view, and this was my next question was going to be about what your respective conceptions about the security situation were. Who was in the ascendancy? Because depending on who's in the ascendancy in the conflict militarily, precisely the points that you make, could embolden one party or another as well. Oh, well, people want to pull out peacekeeping forces as as a real red flag. What kind of information did you have about the inclination of the leadership of the RPF?
I had, there is a difference between delivering messages about U.S. or any government policy and your own private feelings. I was not stupid. I didn't get the job because I didn't know human nature. Right. And I had been, and I had enough, I did not have that much experience with conflict, but I had enough experience with different cultures around the world to understand the difference between actual human relations and forthright conversation and government policy. The fact of the matter was that the United States government policy toward Rwanda was entirely fixed upon the Arusha Accords. We had no plan B. It was the Arusha Accords or nothing. We never sat back because of the impulse of people, because of time, because of the security situation. It was our hope that if people could focus on the transitional government and peace, then we could deal in that process with the underlying conflicts and the violence. If only we could get a better focus. That said, so I understood, and I was part of writing, my talking points, but that didn't mean I was naive enough to think that this delegation from Washington coming to people to say it's this or that would make a difference. Frankly, we, when it came to our judgment as to which side was on the ascendance, militarily, we knew that the RPF could outshoot the government forces because they already had. So there was absolutely no doubt who was going to be the winner in a conflict. And frankly, we hope that the awareness that the government of Rwanda, that government had, would also encourage them to keep the peacekeepers, because no way were they going to win a war. That was self-evident. On the other hand, we did not want another war. And the fact that there were targeted killings of moderate Hutus and Tutsis was very bothersome. And again, we hoped that realigning the focus would work, knowing that the chances of that actually happening was very rare.
What always surprises me now, even 25 years later, is how much the outside world can be present in a situation and yet understand very little about that situation. That's always what has been, even as you parted from Mulindi, between me and Kagame and the chairman Kanyarengwe, he passed away, Chairman Kanyarengwe passed away.
To hear that.
We're talking about it because, especially for Rwandans, but you could say it about Burundians, and you could actually say it about many African cultures. Those are the ones that have studied more than others, but you could say the same thing about Latin America or Asia, where the United States and other Western powers have ventured. Sometimes you get a lot of meaning by what an African is not saying. And that is very difficult to know, because how do you penetrate the minds of these other human beings? And to be able to do that, you would have had to invest a lot in their culture, understanding their culture, understanding their language, understanding their relationships, because then through that you are invited into the mindset of the people among whom you are trying to interact. If you saw so the question as who was in the ascendancy, there's no doubt about it, because in February 1993, I remember Kagame, the current president of Rwanda, had sent me to come to Washington, D.C., so that the operation the military operation we had in February 1993 coincides, because I've worked on the relationship between the United States and the RPF probably longest than any other person. And so we wanted to make sure that when the ceasefire is broken and there's a lot of noise, and sure there was a lot of noise, I was in the State Department to try to explain. And I remember at that time, our forces had gone within actually a short distance of Kigali, which is the capital city of Rwanda. And of course, the United States, the influence of the United States, they put pressure on Museveni, who is the president of Uganda, the principal backer of organization. And I tell you, we were forced to withdraw from the territory that we had captured. And all of us, including myself, were very, very angry. I remember going to the State Department. I met one of the principal deputies at that time in the State Department. I was accompanied in the elevator going down to the lobby. I didn't talk to anyone in the elevator because I was really, really like annoyed. How could we capture territory because men have died? We came within a short distance of the capital city, and now we're being told to go back. So when you put all that together, the Mlindi encounter was such that we knew that should there be an escalation and we go a full military way, we would fit the other side. But one reality which, of course, we always wanted to be appreciative of, because here is a group, a minority group, probably 10% of the total population. The other group, the Hutus, are the majority. We had gone to war assuming that in the classical, guerrilla warfare, which we had read in books, Mao Zedong and Che Guevara and all that, saying that, you go, you capture territory, you work on the population, and the population follows you. In Rwanda, we discovered that every time there was a military operation, the population fled, ran away from us.
Right.
By the time we even captured Kigali city in 1994, we did not have any following amongst the Hutu. So whereas we knew we were militarily strong, we also knew the weakness that on the political side, on the population side, we didn't have a following. Mm-hmm. In fact, for RPF to have defeated the government, a Hutu government, runs against conventional wisdom. Right. It really does. And it has to do more with factors amongst the Hutu community, amongst the Hutu elite, and the division amongst them, more than a strength on the RPF. So yes, we knew we had the power to militarily overrun the other side, but we also knew the uphill task of winning the population on our side.
And was this part, how critical consequently was it that you were able to establish these cantons of forces within Kigali, to have these deployments of troops in Kigali as part of this peace process? How did that relate to this sort of dichotomy where you knew your strength was military, but your weakness was in popular legitimacy, unless I'm misinterpreting what
it is. So you remember earlier I said that between the signing of the agreement and the start of the genocide in April 1994, both sides worked towards preparing for the final showdown. For RPF, it simply meant that we went all over the country clandestinely, especially where the Tutsi population were, because Rwanda, Hutus and Tutsis are not, they're not communities that live separately, where you could say, oh, that's a Tutsi area and this is a Hutu area. We live on the same hills since history began, and we intermarried, we speak one language. So what happened, RPF was able to infiltrate and infiltrate arms, infiltrate agents all over the whole country in the preparation for that, because we had this small territory that we ruled in northern Rwanda. It was like, we used to call it our centimeter. We say our centimeter, which was, it was really small. And so we knew that we didn't have a presence elsewhere. We had no footprint. And so what we had to do was to infiltrate supporters and other people who were sympathetic to RPF in all these places, and that in fact proved to be very useful in the final showdown. So the ceasefire was a blessing for the RPF, and in order to counteract that weakness that we had to use the short interlude of a couple of months to be able to enlarge our footprint in the rest of the country.
I think this, you're making what I think is a very good point about looking at a demarche, and that is that a country like the United States is looking at what was going on in Rwanda from such a different prism from which the people within Rwanda were experiencing what was happening. So we were barely in the same universe, which is why I come back. I'm not even sure whether it was theater, maybe maybe it was interplanetary communication that was going on. But I think a good point that is raised is, how much did I know about your position when I am being sent from Washington, D.C., with the perspective and the issues of Washington, D.C. on my mind, i.e. removing peacekeepers, which the Africa Bureau did not want to do. With every time we did something in Rwanda, we were so sensitive of what was happening in Burundi. And in October of '93, there was a coup d'etat in Burundi just a few months before we went to Rwanda. So we were looking at the map differently. We were looking at a different map through a different prism with different interests and outcomes in mind, and that's why Mulindi was it was an experience that I personally will never forget. I don't know if
yeah, it was
bizarre. Was that?
Yes, and I was telling Chris as we're coming here that looking back 25 years ago to a landmark event that preceded probably one of the most tragic episodes in human history, because for 1 million people to die within 100 days, then to set in motion more tragedies that unfolded in the Democratic Republic of Congo and elsewhere too. So we look back, Rwanda's story is a passionate one. Often it's very, very difficult to have a discussion about Rwanda without, for somebody like me, I'm very much of that story, and that story is still very fresh for me. It's not something that I have a luxury to look back and say, oh, a number of times I've written books and articles about Rwanda, but I always see how much involved I am in it. I come with a perspective. It's very difficult to say, oh, please be an objective academic. Right. I cannot, because I'm part of that story that is still unfolding. And one of the challenges that an organization like mine had when we're dealing with the United States is that on the one hand, you're really trying very hard to win the friendship of the United States because you know how important it is.
And you were very polite.
And you were very polite.
You were very polite. Yeah, no, I appreciate it.
I tell you,
some people I talked to were not.
For others, you should have been there. For others, there were always fireworks. Yes, there were always fireworks. And we would be able to convey a message in very respectful ways, but sometimes a respectful message can be very bitter. And we always knew how to convey that. But for the Americans, on the one hand, you want to win them. And I would say that over a period of 2 years, starting with 1991, I think, we had been trying very, very hard, at least for the United States to listen to us, at least the United States to meet us as one of the actors in the conflict. And to be honest, the United States had done that, and the Rwandan government was not always happy about it, as you know. They were not always happy about that. So we're working on that on the one hand. But on the other, the United States and Western powers, especially for intellectuals and the elite who tend to drive these revolutions, forget about the idea that these revolutions come with very extravagant promises, then they wane and collapse and turn into dictatorships. But in their ascendancy, the elites and intellectuals who run these enterprises are very suspicious of the United States and Western powers. So it's not only the United States which has not been in these areas, especially of Rwanda and Burundi. It was the French and the Belgians. So we are looking at you through the prism of how we look at the West. And there's a lot of suspicion. And the problem is that the United States, like others, because of limited interest in these places, you only come at moments of crisis. And yet, for most of these conflicts, I told you, for me, I'm as old as the Rwandan conflict. I'm 58, and the Rwandan conflict is as old as that, and it's still ongoing. But if you come as Ambassador Bushnell, behind her, the Africa Bureau, they are looking at these events like static pictures, frozen in time. But it's really a movie. It's a movie that has been in the making. And to be able to do that, you would have to invest a lot of time and resources to be that. But Rwanda, once again, is a small country, no natural resources, and big powers are not likely to fight over Rwanda.
Do you know, it also, I think, is a cultural, when you said I lived in Senegal for 5 years, and the Senegalese would say, you can tell when an American wants something, that's the only time they will say hello and extend courtesies. So there is such a, we come in and we have, we're looking at our clocks, and excuse me, the transition government should have been put in place last week, you're late, and time is money, and we need to get on with it. So I appreciate that perspective.
And how did that translate? Of course, now looking forward from Malindi, then of course, as we know, the plane is shot down, the genocide begins almost instantaneously. Instantaneously, also, the RPF, swooped down. What was your impression of who was doing what? What was the sort of integrity of the information that you had, and then how did you decide to use that information, and to what extent did you feel that whatever way you decided to use the information would have some impact on what was going on the ground?
You mean the information from Malindi or the information we had about the plane?
From what you took away from Malindi in terms of what you perceived to be the intent of the RPF, as well as, of course, your predecessor meetings with Habyarimana and his regime. But then, of course, the reports of what was going on in the ground. So, of course, the context and then what you understood to be happening.
The day after we left Malindi, my Department of State colleague and I went immediately to Burundi because there had been rumors of another coup d'etat. So we literally flew from one crisis situation to another crisis situation. When the plane, when I was called, I happened to be acting assistant secretary at the time, received a phone call from the Rwanda-Burundi desk officer who said the plane has been shot down with the presidents of Rwanda and Burundi. You may need to cut this out, but the first thought I had was, shit, it can't be true, because I knew, oh my God, I mean, this was We never anticipated this, and it was a crisis of extraordinary proportion, which did not go away ever. I would say from that moment on, the crisis has continued in various shapes and forms. But it was, you know, if ever you use a curse word, that was a good moment at which to use that curse word. Then our information became very sporadic because we had no intel in Kigali. And the focal point for the Clinton administration was to get all of the Americans out. And there was only one American head of an NGO who remained in Kigali after we got the Americans out. So we had no source of information. And it was, I learned 25 years later, well, while this was going on, I had no idea that our colleagues at the National Security Council in peacekeeping had already been making recommendations that we remove the peacekeepers. I learned in 2015 from a declassified internal memo in the National Security Council that on the 9th of April, our Richard Clark, head of peacekeeping, was sending memos saying we need to remove the peacekeepers. So the same, Richard Clark had never, the NSC didn't want us to be in Rwanda, and as soon as they had an opportunity, notwithstanding the massacres going on, we withdrew the peacekeepers. And I will tell you that I started to look back through the documents we were sending, the cables we sent, and internal documents. And one of the conclusions I came to is that language is so important. We kept referring to what was now a bunch of thugs committing genocide as the government of Rwanda. And we were referring in our reports about the Tutsi rebels. Well, when you look at the balance, who's got the balance of power if one is a government and another group is a rebel? When I looked back, I also noted that the information going up the chain of command at the Defense Department and the National Security Council made references to communal violence. That was not, putting people into churches and throwing grenades in is not communal violence. So there was a shading, I found years later, of how events were being interpreted at the White House that was even more different from what we, who were following events day to day, hour by hour, were seeing. So there was an interplanetary communication between the Africa Bureau and the National Security Council. We were on two different, looking at completely different things.
Right.
And guess who won? Wasn't the Africa Bureau. Right. I can tell you, I mean, a lesson learned is if the National Security Council goes operational in this town, then all of the interagency meetings are going to be charades because the decisions have already been made.
And to what extent were you aware, or you being the RPF, aware of this? And then, so talk us through that initially, the seizure of Kigali, and then how that informed your approach to Rwandan-US relations, your approach, you know, to neighboring countries, of course, in particular the Congo. Take us through those steps.
Chris, that would take us the next 24 hours. But since we don't have that much time, and before I forget, I wanted to emphasize how the shooting down of the plane was a very, very critical trigger. It wasn't the cause, because as I've said, both sides were actually in preparation of what would happen should the peace process fail. But it was a wild card that was introduced in an already explosive mix. And the fact that the president of Rwanda, a Hutu, and the president of Burundi, a Hutu, had died. And the previous year, a president of Burundi, a Hutu, had been killed by Tutsis. It's very difficult to explain to an audience that may not understand these intricacies of ethnic rivalry and conflict and perceptions. But it was a very, very powerful mix. And one of the consequences, of course, as you ably put it, was that we still are dealing with that problem, both in Rwanda, in Burundi, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. So it was a very powerful trigger. Secondly, during that period, from Molindi to the shooting down of the plane and the disbanding of the United Nations peacekeeping force in Kigali, RPF was very crafty. And I say that I used to be its spokesperson, especially during that period.
And you have a crafty look in your eye when you're saying that.
Yes, we're very crafty because, in fact, the action of the United States of subsequently, disbanding this United Nations force and delaying the coming of another part 2 of UNAMIO, it's something that you played into the hands of the RPF, because RPF did not want any peacekeeping force coming into Rwanda. In fact, our language at that time, if you go back and put on CNN, on BBC, we're saying, well, all the Tutsis that had to die are already dead. So what are you coming to do in Rwanda? That's what we used to say during that period of time. Why? Because we could see that the coming of an international force, an international presence, would freeze the conflict and take away the victory that we could see was within reach. That's something that the international, nobody even has written about that, but I'm telling you from an insider, because we worked very, very hard to make sure that UNAMIO does not come.
And we would have conversations about that because it was, we saw the advantage of that strategy. So when I say that when we came into Rwanda, we were equally suspicious of the government and the RPF for the very reason that you talk about.
Yeah, because we sent actually my own brother, Gerard Gahima, and the late Claude Saidi. These are people that were under my jurisdiction. We sent them to New York. They met Madeleine Albright. They made rounds at State Department. Right. They even wrote about it. Recently, I came across beware of writing stuff because they will come back to haunt you. And I saw this press statement that we instructed our representatives here to write, really saying we do not want any international force. But the other thing was that we were always suspicious of the French. And what happened, for United States didn't want to be in this conflict because it had no interest, but because it makes deals with France on other fronts, it could easily sacrifice the interest of another part of the world, just, as a bargain. So we're like, so when the French came to the Americans and say, oh, we would like to have a Chapter 7 peacekeeping force in Rwanda, that was in June 1994. Lo and behold, that's what exactly the United States did. They allowed the French, even when they knew that French could not be an independent and disinterested party in the Rwandan conflict. But that's what happened. So when this happened, you could see that Rwanda, RPF, my organization, was worked at because we didn't want that to happen. But as to what happened subsequently, of course, it's a long story. But to cut it short, RPF came out and it captured power. We set up a government in July 1994. But from then onwards, RPF knew that it could do stuff and could go away with it. That became a distinguishing feature of RPF. And it has used that effectively. It has been able to use guilt on the part of the international community, especially the United States, to know that it can keep on taking more risks and more risks and more risks even when they have grave humanitarian consequences, and simply go away with it. So I think that became the pattern that underlied our going to the Democratic Republic of Congo, what happened there, and the current policy of the United States towards RPF and Rwanda.
And Prue, you said you were having these discussions. You know, you suspected both parties, you know, of intents to undermine the peace process. As this all began to play out, and the preference, I mean, my understanding, of course, was that the provision of French peacekeepers was geographically specific, right? So it was really they came in and they secured the exit into Congo of the Interahamwe and others. So it to some extent it did not necessarily impede what you just put forward as the primary objective, which was to seize Kigali and the capital. Correct me if I'm wrong.
The intention, though, the intention on the part of the French was not necessarily geographic. I think one needs to look at it in a broader context. In fact, when we knew that the French were going to deploy, I was the one who was sent to Paris with my colleague. He's late, he passed away. We went to Paris and we met the then Foreign Minister, Alain Juppé, at that time. And I was trying to convey the sentiment of the RPF that if you know that we do not see you as an independent, objective stakeholder in this conflict, why are you coming? In fact, that afternoon, I did meet some generals, French generals who were preparing for Operation Turquoise. And I posed the question, I say, from, you know, I was a doctor who was trying to learn military language, but my boss had told me what to ask. I said, if you are going for this peacekeeping force under Chapter 7, why do you have all these French Jaguars and all this? Why do you have? He said, you know, it's our lesson from Bosnia. We've learned that if we go to a conflict area, we better be prepared to be able to be forceful in the case we are needed like that. And so it's in this kind of combustible mix that French was undertaking to come to Rwanda. And in fact, inside RPF, we knew we were going to fight that time, we knew we were going to fight for a long time. We started telling people, you know, our soldiers how to prepare for a long war because we didn't know what France is going to do. But fortunately or unfortunately, they were supporting a group that was really declining in terms of thinking, in terms of strategic thought. They had already lost the war, and especially genocide had made sure that they had lost the war. And so whatever the French could do, it could not salvage a group like that one. And so very quickly they lost the war and crossed into neighboring Congo and started another chapter of conflict.
And given what Theo has just said, and looking back firstly to the Demarche and the meeting, and then going through, as a Foreign Service officer, you know, what what would you change if you could go back in time, knowing what you know now?
The United States and most governments look at the foreign perspective from a binary point of view. You either use hard power or you use soft power. And what Rwanda and the Mulindi Demarche clearly shows is that if people are using hard power to come in with only a demarche and words and a diplomatic request to stop fighting, you're not going to stop the killing. The conclusion I've come to after many, many years of thinking about this, and by the way, also thinking about terrorism, is that The opposite of hard power shouldn't be soft power, it should be smart power. We never looked at how we could resolve what was happening other than boots on the ground. It was either we have boots on the ground or we do nothing at all. Never did we think, all right, what if we use smart power? And I will define it for you because I've been thinking about it. What if we started looking at our foreign policies and interventions from strategic, moral, achievable, reliable, and transformational? What if we had applied that lens to the conflict in Rwanda before we went into the Arusha Peace Accords? Because once again, you had, okay, conflict, well, let's sign a document and then we'll say it's over. No, 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 no. We didn't look at the possibilities of NGOs. We didn't look at the possibility of, my heavens, why did we not call the Pope and all the senior religious leaders around the world and say, would you please telephone every single cleric in Rwanda so that it can at least shut their churches? I mean, it never, any kind of innovative thought never, ever occurred to us. And that is what I think the diplomacy of the 21st century needs to do, is number one, start thinking about how to do things smartly rather than softly or with a gun. You know, we're creative enough. And the second very critical lesson I learned is that as long as we look at events around the world purely through a prism of national security, we will continue to be bystanders to genocide. And I think one of the lessons and the unfinished business that we leave other governments is to look not just at national security, but at human security. 1 million people were killed. At what a toll it must be for the RPF that you were following a hard power strategy while children were being hacked to death in churches, and you knew it and we knew it, and we stood by, because for us it was an issue of national security, it didn't meet our standard, and for you it was a question of hard power and the national security of your government. It's not just a question anymore of safeguarding governments or fronts, no matter how popular they may be, but also of safeguarding, of looking through the prism of human security, because if you don't, it will never go away, and Rwanda is a case in point. We're still looking at death and horror.
I want to know if you can very briefly respond to that, and then I don't know if we could take Q&A if there are any questions from the audience. Theo.
Yes, just to build on two lessons for me that stand out. I entirely agree with what my colleague Ambassador Bushner is saying. But the first lesson I have learned, I wish I didn't, but I've also learned to be, I won't call it being disillusioned, but I came to the RPF and the organization with very lofty ideals of transforming society. If you read what we wrote and what we said at that time, you could read on our faces that we're playing hardball, but we also, amongst us, there are people who had the idea that we're in this business to transform the Rwandan society. In international relations, what the United States or Western powers, or now these days China and Russia, with regard to Africa, I become more realistic in that I have now come to discover that even powerful countries, or especially powerful countries, get interested in these parts of the world precisely through the prism of what they call the national interest. And that, as you know, does not necessarily have moral connotations or moral kind of considerations. So I'm more realistic, And I would wish to frame it in terms of now that the United States or China or any other country has these national interests, how do we frame our own national interests, Rwanda or Ghana or Indonesia or some other countries, and how do we find the middle ground where your interests are catered for and my interests are catered for? I say that because I see a lot of confusion amongst the African elite, especially these days. There's a scramble to run to China and to say that China is our new savior. I do not buy into that. I also agree that Africa has a chance to relate to China or any other power for its African countries for their own national interests. But I believe the middle ground is where we consider the interests of both parties and figure out how do we act on this. The second lesson I've come out with is that it takes a lot of investment and leveraging resources to be able to be useful in any given situation. I see United States, and I'm free to say what I want. I won't be put in jail for that here in this country. At least that's what we enjoy coming to America. America is the country that uses a lot of resources outside and is actually increasingly unable to leverage these resources to build trust and lasting relationships. You go to Africa, you spend billions of money on HIV/AIDS. You will go to Africa with USAID resources. You have lots of resources. You know, if you look at all the agencies and all of government of the United States and the footprint that you have, although people would say that your footprint is declining, but these are lots of resources. It is possible to leverage these resources and create more value, but especially be able to build trust and the relationships that will be very critical on a rainy day when you want to use these both in preventing conflict, but also in mitigating conflict. Those are the two things that I would add to what my colleague has ably said.
So can we now take some questions from the audience, if there are any? And I'm not seeing a hand just yet, but so I will abuse my position as chair and just ask, neither of you talked about the capacity for violence and where that comes from, right? And of course, you talk about the French and their continued support for the government. That included providing the government with arms, with the means to carry out violence. Of course, your party from the conflict had external support as well, you know, predominantly from Uganda. But then, of course, Uganda enjoyed support, you know, from global actors as well. When you talk about using smart and soft power, you know, and we talk about then the predominantly US designed response to the genocide as well, in terms of, okay, what are the rules and, you know, like what should be the consequences for what's happened. And they set up this, you know, International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and they prosecute sort of how war is waged, not necessarily the illegal waging of war, like, which is, you know, what of course your own prosecutor Jackson said was the crime of all crimes back at Nuremberg. And now as we see armed conflict, increasingly of an intrastate nature, i.e. increasingly major powers fighting one another indirectly via proxy. You know, we're not necessarily, we're still seeing these local actors held accountable. And of course, you know, with the Rwanda tribunal, we saw only the Hutu party to the conflict held accountable for how they waged the war, and not any of the leadership of the RPF. That's a separate conversation. But of course, no one from outside the country held accountable for the material support that they provided, you know, knowing what they knew about both parties to the conflict, given the conflict had gone on for 4 years, you know, and both groups, you know, had engaged in, you know, war crimes or crimes against humanity up until the point of the genocide. Just a question about about that. Was that ever raised? Was there any sense of you know, of what might happen, or introspection in terms of could we reach out to our other global interlocutors to say, look at what has happened here, not only our non-intervention, but actually our role in, you know, in providing support. Can we come to some arrangement, you know, about when we provide lethal force, under what circumstances, and how?
Well, the United States certainly, and thanks in part to the work of Samantha Power, adopted, as did the UN, the responsibility to protect, RP2. But ultimately, intervention requires the political will to do so. And as long as we are looking at it through the lens of the interests of a government only, rather than the interest of a society and a government for the human beings of other countries, then we're going to have terrorism, we're going to have climate change, we're going to have poverty and so forth, because it's not in our interest.
I give you a very practical example in the case of Rwanda, which is at the heart of the work I try to do in terms of promoting truth and reconciliation in Rwanda. Maybe something like the South Africans were able to do when everyone expected explosion and confusion after the fall of the apartheid regime. And as you ably put it, you said that the post-genocide Rwandan justice system, both at the local and international level, has looked at the perpetrators as the Hutu people. And that side has many of them who allegedly participated in the genocide have been brought to justice. There are many others. But there's not a single one on the RPF side among the Tutsis, because it's the victor describes the parameters of justice.
It is not in the U.S. national interest to go after members of the current government who could have been perpetrators
in
of
fact,
genocide.
Every time this matter of accountability on the part of our side, our group of the RPF, the United States and the United Kingdom have really come to the vigorous defense against holding accountable members of organizations for the crimes allegedly they might have committed. And that is why, of course, I say that this very beginning, many people believe that Americans and British people are also Tutsi.
What we can do for questions, I think.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any?
Yes,
Oh, okay. Okay, good. Okay.
No, what you can do, since it's difficult to go around and try to, you know, record
Pass the
each
mic.
question, if
Right.
you will repeat the question,
Okay.
then
Yep.
we'll catch it on the tape and you can answer it.
Great.
So if someone has a question,
Yeah.
they can raise their hand.
I think we have one here, sir. Yes.
Yeah, you both touched on President Kagame's ability to leverage the international community's skills, or the United States' skills, over a lack of action into perhaps a lack of criticism over activities inside of Rwanda, or Rwanda's activities in the DRC, for example. I'm wondering, with sort of revelations of various authoritarianism tactics in Rwanda, activities in the DRC, how much of that shine has gone away? In other words, how much of that ability to leverage that guilt has diminished? And it seems to me he's sort of replaced it with showing off Rwanda as a successful developmental state with economic growth and so on, and that's the new sort of way of leveraging his success. So I'm wondering if you could sort of comment on that transition.
So just to repeat, to what extent has the guilt associated with inaction endowed Kagame with a level of impunity from U.S. consequence, and arguably as some consequences has come to transpire, you know, to what extent has he then lent on this idea that, you know, Rwanda is Africa's Singapore, or, you know, is a shining light of development, but without, of course, you know, the innovation of Lee Kuan Yew with the integration, social integration that he drove in his in his country.
No, you're absolutely right. It's no longer as powerful or used more frequently as it used to, but he still has it as the arrows in the quiver, as the saying goes, and is very selective on how he deploys it, especially when there is any argument or any insistence that he opens political space in Rwanda, then he will quickly say, oh, do you remember? You remember where we were in 25 years ago? We've built a wonderful political system here, and you want us to allow genocide to happen again? And then instantly, even the powerful ones like United States and everyone else keeps quiet, and has probably used it against former President Clinton than anybody else, because he knows that President Clinton presided over the international system way back in 1994. And because of that, President Clinton and former Prime Minister Tony Blair of the United Kingdom, but more Clinton than Blair, have become really powerful advocates of President Kagame and what he's been doing in the country. And in fact, I read something where President Clinton described Kagame as one of the most visionary leaders has ever seen on planet Earth. I don't know whether we inhabit the same planet, but that's what he said. So he's been able to use it, and especially to advance that other second part of selling the idea that Rwanda is the most developing and the kind of development model. But what he forgets, and what therefore countries like United States, going back to what Ambassador Bushni was saying and what I was saying, is that if you're looking 10, 15, 20 years from now on the potential for violent conflict in Rwanda, you should not be looking at the development model, because that's not what trips nations into crisis, especially countries like ours. It's the power structures, those it has included and those it has excluded, and especially when there is this ethnic mix that trips these societies into violent conflict. So they won't say, oh, he built skyscrapers, he brought another car factory into Rwanda. There is a Volkswagen factory in Rwanda now, and there are drones flying in Rwanda. And recently it was in the public that he has sent a satellite to how, I don't know. I haven't read it to find out. But these are the kind of things they say, but that is not the fundamental problem of Rwanda or Burundi. For those countries like DRC and Uganda, and especially Rwanda and Burundi, it's how do you evolve some innovative power structures that allow inclusion to take place and allow healing to take place, because the communities can find themselves in these structures that you are trying to build. But at the end of the day, if it's simply a scramble for the elites for power, and they know that it's a very, very dangerous game. It is a zero-sum game. You win, somebody loses. And the loser dies or simply goes into exile if he's lucky.
Thanks, Chris. Dr. Rudasinghe, can you tell us a little bit about your path back to the United States and how you think about your own exile and perhaps how you might hope to go back to Rwanda?
Pardon me. Could you repeat that question?
Yeah,
Yes,
sure.
that's a very important question, yes.
Thank you for a great discussion today. Dr. Rudasinghe, can you tell us a little about your path to the United States, how you view your exile, and perhaps if you hope to go back to Rwanda at some point, and how you feel about your positionality in 2019?
There's no need for me to repeat, right?
Yes. Thank you so much for that question. And I've been reflecting a lot on that question myself, and it's never easy. But to say three things. One is that being able to disengage from the RPF, the Rwandese Patriotic Front, for which I spent so much of my youthful energy, my everything that I had. I was, at that time when I was in the struggle, as we call it, I didn't have a wife. I didn't have children. I now have a wife and I have 4 children. And so the process of disengaging from something that you are passionately involved in came with a lot of introspection, because each one of us has to decide, do I remain or do I leave? And that moment came because I had to decide whether I was really still interested in playing power by itself, the power game. And I had a cold moment where I could see that I was no longer interested to do that, but I was very much interested in figuring out how do we kind of channel our energies into something lasting, something long-term. And I could see the politics that we're playing day by day were no longer contributing to that kind of long-term project as I thought. And I did my part in encouraging my boss, the president of Rwanda, to the best of my knowledge. But at some point, if you're an advisor, you've got to decide. If your advice is no longer valued, then you've got to figure out. And in Africa, disagreeing with the president is not what you guys do here. You can shout and go on TV and curse the president and write wherever you want to write. This is America. When we came to this country in 2005, my young son, who was then 6, would come from school and he wanted to put on TV. And I say, Aaron, we don't do that. You don't play TV on a school day. Then one day he laughed. He said, Daddy, this is America. We do what we want. And so, but I said, okay, maybe I need to part, and I parted in 2005. It's a long story, but it carried with it a big risk. Parting in that kind of fashion carries a big risk, and I wrote to the president when I was still in Rwanda, and I told him that I was no longer interested to be in the RPF. I was no longer interested in government, and that I was going to pursue other things. That is one. 2, many years later, because having been involved in a story like this one, you cannot also disengage from the story. 1, because you're Rwandan. 2, I have lost, I haven't mentioned this, but I don't often say it, but in the course from the time I became a refugee when my father was killed, up to the Rwandan genocide, I've counted at least 55 close relatives who've been killed. So can you disengage from that story? Does even the trauma that you yourself have lived through allow you to simply withdraw? I've discovered that it's not very easy. So for some time, I've been trying to encourage some Rwandans on the issue of, truth-telling as a way, because I'm a physician also, I know that doctors, in order to heal, or rather to be instruments of healing, you've got to engage your client or your patient in telling their story, hopefully that telling of the story can help in the process of healing. And South Africa tried that, and Burundi also tried it a bit, and there are some other examples across the world. And so because in 2010, I decided to write like an advisory to President Kagame. You can look for it under Rwanda Briefing. It's online. So instead of taking this as bitter advice, but of a former colleague and friend and somebody that when we used to come to Washington, D.C., we used to sleep in the same small hotels across the Potomac. But he took offense, and he instructed that the courts try me and others for that were trying to destabilize the country. So I was sentenced to 24 years in jail. As a matter of fact, he sent extradition request to the United States in 2011. Right. But of course, the United States never honored that because they could see that this was a politically motivated kind of stuff. So in terms of going back to Rwanda in the short term, under President Kagame's reign, I'm afraid that may not be possible. However, the third component of my response to you is a bit faith-filled because I'm a Christian. And I kind of hang on to the hope and the faith based on my Christian conviction. And I take it, even for those who are not Christians, you can go back and read the Bible as a text, as an interesting historical text, those who are not Christians. One of the famous exiles, the prophet Jeremiah, and his people, the Jews, had been banished to Babylon. And what happens when you're in exile is that you're caught up in a tension. On the one hand, there's me who says, I really must go back to Rwanda. And that can paralyze you because in the period of waiting, you actually underlook other things you should be doing as part of being a human being. And on the other, you want to say, maybe I need to settle down because now I'm no longer as young as I was 25 years ago, and I need to settle down and do the kind of things that somebody should be doing. And so in that letter, Prophet Jeremiah says, work for the peace and prosperity where you've gone into exile. Because if that space, if that country, or if that community, if that nation finds peace and prosperity, you too shall find peace and prosperity. So the peace and prosperity of the United States has of late become a major preoccupation of mine. I do, honestly. I do, and I do struggle on LinkedIn. I do, in order to say I'm interested in these issues. So that's how I would respond to your question. But that was a very good question, and you can read some passion on my face on that. Yeah, please.
There's a number of documentaries and feature films about what happened in Rwanda, and I'm wondering of those which ones you might think are most accurate, or the ones you'd recommend to someone who maybe doesn't have the time or a huge interest in knowing, but you maybe want to push that person to know a little bit about it. Which documentary or film on the crisis would you think is the best introduction to someone who doesn't know much and who won't delve deep into the situation?
Maybe while I catch my breath. Maybe ask Ambassador Bushnell. I will also add to what you say. Yeah.
I don't make it a practice to watch documentaries on Rwanda because it was a soul-searing experience for me. I will say that I was played in a film called Sometimes in April by an actress by the name of Deborah Winger, on whom my husband developed a huge crush, I will say. And she sat down with me and the script, and we went through the script together to make sure that in her portrayal that things were accurate. And I had her put in the script, was so happy, an incident which colored the kinds of horrible interagency working group meetings we were having. I wanted very much to stop the hate radio stations. If we were not going to put boots on the ground, we could at least put something in the air to jam the radio stations. And first, I was told by DOD colleagues that it was against international law. Then I was told that it was too expensive. Then I was told that it wouldn't make any difference because they would find other networks. Then I was told there was no jamming station in the United States, it was all in Haiti. And finally, I was told by a man in uniform, kindly, Prue, radios don't kill people, people kill people. And I said, I'm going to quote you, and Deborah Winger put it in the script. I have not watched, with the exception of Black Earth Rising. Have you seen that?
No.
It is a very recent made-for-Netflix film that I found to be absolutely searing and raises some of the issues you talk about. So I would, you know, sometime in Rwanda, I found, certainly from the American perspective, seemed to be pretty accurate. I'm not sure if you've seen it or.
And to add to that, because the RPF was behind the project sometimes in April, so it tells a more, it tells a deep. Yes,
No
yes, the RPF is yes. The other film I would recommend, not that it tells the story, but simply it raises the consciousness. It's Hotel Rwanda. Hotel Rwanda is the one that is mostly known. It is told from a very narrow perspective and tells one version of the story. So movies, in order to have clientele, they have to tell their stories in a particular way. But the hope is that when you see that, maybe you can pick some interest and go to do your own reading and your own research. But both sometimes in April and Hotel Rwanda are good starting points.
Can I also add, and maybe I'm being old-fashioned here, but there are also some fantastic books on the conflict. And if I was to recommend one, it would be that by a gentleman called Mahmoud Mamdani, who is professor of African history at Columbia University, but also at Makerere, where in Kampala, Uganda. It's called When Victims Become Killers. And it very much encapsulates you know, the themes of some of what I think Prue and Theo have told us, which he goes back, you know, to the 1950s and the experience of the Tutsis, many of whom fled, you know, into Uganda. They were the victims, and the sons and daughters, you know, of that experience did not forget, you know, arguably one of which we have here. And they came back. And the lesson they had learned was, if you want to come back, you need to come back with force, you know, and they did. They employed that strategy. And one might also argue now, those that they chased across the border that are over in the Congo have also learned that lesson, you know. And the nature of governance in Rwanda is such that if they want to come back, you know, they need to do so also, you know, with force. And this is a very, you know, unfortunate symptom and consequence of a failure to engage in an inclusive form of governance at every level of society. I think that's what you both spoke to well.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you both very much for being here, and that leads very much to a question that I have, an overarching question. You look at the Balkans, and give or take 10 years, every 50 years, one side gets up, kills the other side, and they do it over and over again. And there's been a lot of conflict in that region, and lots of places. And you see pedagogy of the press, you see these patterns establish themselves. How we as the United States interrupt it from, I don't know, and as citizens, from whatever perspective that we need to employ to get our political leaders to act in a moral fashion? And likewise, is it possible to curb a new government, to have them act in a way that is inclusive and that breaks that cycle? You know, as a member of the RPF, formerly and with your knowledge, does that idealism exist in the Rwandan government to be able to do that?
Yeah, unfortunately, that idealism has ceased to be. There used to be the idealism, and not only RPF, but we didn't even mention other political players in Rwanda at that time, who were in the opposition and who were also Hutu, who really wanted change. You could see that it was a violent moment, but one that was also fraught with a lot of dynamism.
And this was why we kept saying it's got to be the Arusha Accord.
Yes.
Because, there was that hope.
Yeah, so that dynamism has vanished because taking power by violent means, if it fails in everything else, it particularly fails in giving space to that idealism to flourish. Often, sometimes I get impatient and act, and when I meet some American friends or European friends, and they say, somehow being apologetic to some of these regimes in Africa, one, I always tell them, if you were to go and live, if somebody asks you to go and live there, you wouldn't go there and live there. You wouldn't, probably. If you did, you would have to have a privileged status because you're a foreigner. But I always ask them, the people that you adore because of the role they have in your own history, in the case of the United States, the George Washingtons, the Jeffersons, the founding fathers, do you remember that when they imagined this republic, they were on horseback and on foot? Their armies were on foot. They were starving, they being killed by cold and miserable conditions. They didn't even have what we in Rwanda have today. Rwanda would have seemed like an advanced state if you compared the days of George Washington to. So what the African elite, we African elite, what we lack is that kind of sustained imagination that even in poverty, even in conditions of lack, even with imperfect institutions, even with all these things that can happen, still there has to be some people who can imagine that this tiny republic can be much better 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, and so on and so forth. Because elsewhere on this planet, there are examples where it has happened. That is one. Two, I really think that foreign powers, especially right now, we've entered a very tricky period, like a Cold War kind of period, where the United States, in its competition with China, with Russia, with all these forces, non-state actors, terrorism, all these security considerations, like it happened during the Cold War, the United States may find itself in bed with terrible people because of national interest. Like they decided to be with Mobutu, this other dictator who used to rule the Democratic Republic of Congo, or be supportive of, I won't mention who I met. I once was talking to people in the State Department about 3 years ago, 4 years ago, and I mentioned, why does the United States really cling to the president of Rwanda, the president of Uganda, and the president of the prime minister of Ethiopia, the late Meles Zenawi. And he quietly says, Theo, Rwanda and Ethiopia and Uganda help us with peacekeeping. So I got the message. But we've entered a period, I don't know how it's going to end up, but many of you are the experts. Either you've been in the field or upcoming, but it's one trend to watch, because that in itself will mean that for these elites who should otherwise imagine something better for our populations and decide simply to do the opposite, the United States might find them as its allies. And that will certainly be a trend that will undermine the flourishing of democracy and human rights in the years to come.
We've got time for just one or maybe two questions if your answers are not too long.
Yeah, 1 and 2, please.
Okay, thank you. As I prepare to head out to the region as the deputy in charge of mission in Central African Republic, I've been listening intently and taking notes. And I'm just wondering what advice both of you might have for people like me or people who are in leadership positions representing our governments in countries that are in conflict and who are seeking peaceful outcomes to complex conflict situations. So, thank you.
The two most important leadership skills I learned were asking powerful questions and listening to the answers. What we who deliver demarches are not asking questions, we're talking. And we're not listening either. So to be able to engage and because relationships are so important. I also learned the value of community in my time in Africa, and you spend time with people, you care about their family, you ask about the family, and then ask powerful questions and see if there's an area that can be nurtured for peace. And if nothing else, you end up at least understanding a little bit more on each side.
And to build on that, especially to look out and listen out for what is not being said.
That's a very good point.
Yes.
Very good point.
Yes, and
yes.
often it's not even the official people that will tell you. It might be if you're in a taxi or talking to people who are not in government, they might be ordinary people. They might mention something that could be, very informational and very useful in trying to build a much better picture of what is going on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You'll have to forgo your formal vehicle so you can take the taxi everywhere. Please, sir.
Yeah, thank you. It was very instructive, and I'm originally from Burundi.
Oh.
So all the story was going really straight home when you were talking. And as the ambassador was saying, you lost a lot of people. I do too. And most of them also were some of those who were fighting close to you, with you, because I went to school with a lot of them and some of those generals. So I'm in that generation. In Burundi, those who are in power, we play soccer. So like the president, we call each other by first name. So, and I have an opportunity here at FSI for the past 9 years now to work with diplomats and all those ambassadors in either Kigali or Bujumbura. And believe it or not, they try to do this smart power approach when they are working with us. And that's what we can kind of deliver. So one of the questions which I will never forget, one of the ambassadors asked me, Gilbert, what do people in Burundi will expect from me? So he wanted to go kind of navigate in my mind and see really what to expect. So of course I had to joke. I said, well, coming from United States, what do you think? They want the big bucks as well. But there's a lot of things here you talked about. I cannot really, in few minutes, talk about all of them. But the Arusha Accord. In Burundi, the Arusha Accord, those who are in power now are trying really to kind of destroy them completely. And those are the ones who, at some point, brought back a kind of peace in Burundi. So now my question is, what the world, because Burundi has reached now the bottom. You cannot go deeper than where we are now. We cried, we called the United Nations everywhere to send troops. Nothing has done. So he's smart enough to know that he won't do the genocide the way it happened in the past. And by the way, for those who don't follow, prior to the genocide in Rwanda, a few months before, 300,000, so it seems like it's little compared to a million, but it's 300,000 Burundians who died. So, but what was done then? Nothing. What's going on? Every day I receive phone call of friends, family members disappearing, tortured, but nothing is being done. So I don't know. And again, somebody said again, well, national security. And when we are doing our training with these ambassadors, everybody else, it's what we put on the table. Probably so far we don't have those minerals, but so far there are troops in Somalia. Burundian provided a lot of troops in Somalia. So that's a kind of a payback or something. So my question again, what can be done? What should we do to kind of stop what's going on in those countries? People die every single day. Actually, he shut down the televisions and radio and burned them, literally burned them. So something can be done without nobody knowing outside. Thank you.
let me say that I was always concerned, when was it going to happen in Burundi? And then one day I had an aha saying, oh my God, it is happening. But it is, as you point out, it was below the radar. And Rwanda took a huge amount of airtime and highlights away from Burundi, so that it was never. Well, so it was always, well, it's Rwanda because that's the level of killing was so massive, and the level of guilt it left behind in the U.S. government was so huge. That never happened in Burundi because not enough of your fellow citizens have been killed. I frankly do not know how one puts the political will into human beings at senior levels of the United States government to intervene in any way. And what I would do is work with the human rights community, the memorial, the U.S. Holocaust Museum, and start making noises that way, bringing it to the attention of the American people. Because unless you have the attention of the American people or the Congress, the people who have been voted into the White House are going to say, not in our interest, sorry.
Just one brief comment. To say, as a brother from Africa, from Burundi, and I would say that this shouldn't disappoint you, but unfortunately, this is what I was saying much earlier, that I've become a little more realistic than I was many years ago, not to expect much from the rest of the world. At the end of the day, it's the duty of us, the Africans, to put our houses in order. If we don't, there's nobody who's going to do it for us. Unfortunately, it doesn't mean that we stop advocating.
Right.
We have to continue. We have to continue sometimes to shame the people who simply sit and do nothing. But 25 years later, having seen the story of Rwanda, the story of DRC, the story of Burundi, as I told you, as a baby, my mother first ran to Burundi as a refugee, like many others. And so I always ask myself, why should, after 50 years of political independence, why should Africans expect somebody else to come and say, oh, stop killing your own people, stop killing your own children, stop killing, and sometimes it really sounds so bad and so cynical for me to say that, but unfortunately that's the reality, yeah.
I can respond a little bit because that wasn't really, like I said, I might not maybe seem that old, but I'm old enough and I've traveled all those countries and been in a position where I have direct talk, and those were the answers given to me in a way it's not direct, and I understood. But the problem is those who are inside the country, the same way they welcome anybody they see, they might be so naive. Those don't have a little piece of bread to put on the table. And they used to see, back in the days, some big remorque, that's French, big truck bringing some food or something. So again, when they see those coming to Africa, they expect some kind of help. But again, it's going to come from us. And that I wanted just to let you know that I know very well. Thank you.
I think that's the perfect place to end, with this tension between, the realist self-interest of the local actors as well as those on the outside trying to further their interest on the inside. And I think that's precisely why, the Association of Diplomatic Studies and Training there, this initiative is so important, so that people can look back, to learn about how, one can advance, an inclusive internal society in the places where you will work, particularly putting out red lines where those tensions between that objective and nationalist, realist self-interest come into tension. So thank you, Susan, for your leadership.
I want to thank you, Dr. Rudasingwa, and you, Ambassador Bushnell, and you, Chris, for process of sharing all of that, and I want to thank everybody who's come. We're trying to sort of figure out how we can structure some of these deeper dives and conversation and to really learn from situations and then pull out some of the key points or themes or, I don't know, elements, principles, whatever they may be. So we appreciate you coming, and we're going to be looking to find other kinds of conversations or follow up or what's the best mode, and then what we can do of all this video, that thanks to Mark, Mark Foss, our videographer, who's done a great job here. So thank you all. Unfortunately, we've been told that we have to be out of here by 6 o'clock on pain of I don't know what, something terrible, and we have to gather up the equipment in the room. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Prue.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. Thank you, Prue.